In 2005, in an isolated Romanian monastery, a young nun was tied to a wooden cross. 3 days, no food, no water, her mouth sealed shut. They claimed a demon lived inside her and prayed over her day and night. When it was over, all of Romania held its breath. This isn't a legend. This is Tanacu. Subscribe to Duskwoven, where true stories are darker than any fiction. On the map of Romania, the Tanacu Monastery is barely a dot, a few miles from the nearest town, surrounded by cornfields and power lines. No tourists, no pilgrims, just a handful of nuns and one young priest who believed evil could be driven out with the force of prayer. Maricica Irina Cornici was only 23 when she passed through Tanacu's gates. She grew up in an orphanage, raised by the state, in a country still haunted by the shadow of communism and poverty. For many like her, the monastery was a last refuge, a shelter from hunger, loneliness, and the streets. At first glance, she seemed quiet, obedient, always with her head lowered. But in 2005, something began to change. The sisters noticed Irina talking to herself, falling into long silences, then suddenly screaming. She claimed she heard voices, that something touched her at night. A doctor from nearby Vaslui diagnosed her with paranoid schizophrenia. For the nuns, that diagnosis meant nothing. In their eyes, she wasn't sick. She was possessed. Instead of a psychiatrist, she would get prayer. And watching over those prayers was Father Daniel Corogianu, a 29-year-old monk who believed the devil could truly live inside a human body, and that it was his duty to drive it out. Father Daniel Corogianu wasn't an ordinary monk. Young, with a narrow face and an ascetic gaze, he called himself the guardian of Tanacu's spiritual purity. He was only 29, but in this isolated monastery, his word carried more weight than any bishop's. The sisters trusted him completely. When he spoke of demons, no one asked for proof. When Irina started falling into trances, screaming during prayers, throwing icons and cursing, Daniel saw it as a sign. He didn't believe the psychiatrist from Vaslui who gave Cornici injections and sedatives. To him, the doctors were helpless against Satan. He performed the first quiet exorcisms alone at night. The sisters later said they heard chanting, chains rattling, thuds against the walls. Irina would tremble through the night, speaking in languages she had never learned. When they woke her at dawn, she stared at them with empty eyes. Over time, more nuns began whispering that Irina had brought evil into the monastery. In Tanacu, the devil became real. He had the face of a quiet orphan girl. Father Daniel was convinced the official church would ignore the problem, so he had to handle it alone. He gathered the sisters in the chapel. There, in the half-light, he made them swear an oath of obedience. He told them a test of faith was coming, that the demon would try to break them, with screams, lies, wounds. But they could not give in, or else the evil one would stay in Tanacu forever. A psychiatrist who came to Tanacu after hearing complaints from the nuns found Irina feverish, her hands bound, eyes sunken like someone who hadn't slept in days. He tried to take her to a hospital, but Daniel and the sisters refused. They claimed the doctor didn't understand, that his injections only fed the demon. Word of the possessed nun slowly began to leak out. Villagers were afraid to speak openly, but whispered about the screams coming from behind the monastery walls. For them, Tanacu had always been a holy place, but now it stirred unease. Inside, Father Daniel knew prayer alone would no longer be enough. A ritual was needed, a real exorcism like in the old days, with a cross, fasting, and sacred hymns. The sisters believed his every word, and Irina no longer had the strength to say no. The ritual was set to begin at dawn. The Tanacu Monastery was shrouded in mist as Father Daniel gathered the sisters in the main chapel. A wooden cross, crudely built from planks, leaned against the altar. Icons on the walls looked down on the scene that was about to unfold in this house of prayer. Irina was too weak to resist. She had barely eaten for days. Every attempt to feed her ended in vomiting or violence. When she tried to break free, the nuns tied her wrists with straps. She said she saw demons, that the devil was lodged in her throat, clawing at her tongue. For Father Daniel, that was proof the possession had reached its peak. Court records later showed that Irina's hands and feet were bound to the wooden beams of the cross. Her mouth was gagged. Daniel claimed it was to stop the demon from cursing through her lips. The sisters kept vigil in shifts. They read passages from the Gospels, chanted hymns, sprinkled her with holy water. Each one was convinced they were saving her soul. Instead of medicine, prayer. Instead of a hospital, a cold, damp chapel smelling of wax and stale incense. Irina burned with fever, drifted in and out of consciousness, whispered incoherent words. When she opened her eyes, she saw Daniel's face above her. His hands lifted a crucifix, his lips muttering Latin and Romanian prayers. According to one nun's testimony, in the final hours, Irina stopped moving altogether. The sisters took it as a sign. The demon was weakening. She was given no food, no water. When she tried to drink, they said it would only nourish the devil. The prayers went on for 3 days and 3 nights without pause. The monastery filled with the smell of sweat, melting candles, and a human body that had no more strength left. When Irina finally stopped responding, one of the nuns ran out to the road. She flagged down a passing car and begged for an ambulance. Paramedics from Vaslui recorded in their report, patient in critical condition, dehydrated, visible signs of restraint. They injected her with adrenaline, tried to attach an IV, but her body was too far gone. Her heartbeat was faint, her breathing shallow. On the way to the hospital, Irina never opened her eyes again. She was 23. On that wooden cross, in the monastery that was supposed to be her refuge, she met her end in a silence where no one could tell prayer from a crime anymore. At the hospital, doctors declared her dead. The autopsy was clear. Dehydration, exhaustion, sores on her wrists, marks from the gag. Prosecutors arrived at Tanacu that same day. When investigators stepped into the chapel, the cross still stood in the corner. The candles were still burning, as if no one dared to put them out. The nuns kept silent. Father Daniel, dressed in his black cassock, insisted he did what he had to do. He believed it wasn't Irina who died, but the demon inside her. But in the eyes of the law, this was no exorcism. It was a prison that killed. Word of Irina's death spread through Romania within days. Cameras from foreign news stations lined up outside Tanacu's gate, asking how, in the 21st century, someone could be tied to a cross in the name of God. Father Daniel did not run. In court, he stood calmly in his black cassock, a cross on his chest. He repeated that he was no murderer. He had saved a soul. He claimed he would do it again if he could turn back time. The nuns said the same. They weren't killers, just instruments of God's will. Doctors were merciless. The psychiatric report made it clear. Irina suffered from schizophrenia that could have been treated with medication. The autopsy confirmed dehydration, exhaustion, wounds from the bindings. The court had no doubts. This was no miracle, it was a crime. Father Daniel was sentenced to 7 years in prison, one nun to 6 years, and 3 others to 5. The monastery chapel was closed, and for years Tanacu became a symbol of religious fanaticism spiraling out of control. The Orthodox Church distanced itself from the entire affair, condemning unauthorized exorcisms. But in the nearby villages, whispers lingered that Irina truly was possessed, that Father Daniel did what he had to do. Today, the Tanacu Monastery is overgrown with weeds and silence. The wooden cross is gone, but its shadow still hangs over the place. And the question of who was truly possessed, Irina, Father Daniel, or everyone who watched and stayed silent, remains unanswered. Stay with us and subscribe to Duskwoven, because true darkness begins where fairy tales end.